Hello and Happy New Year's! It's the end of another trip around the sun, which is as good a time as any to talk about books. Not too long ago, I put out a video about how I picked up reading as a hobby and all of the things that helped me become a reader. As I made that video, I was reminded how useful it was early on in my reading journey to have good recommendations for what to read next. And so, I'm releasing 2 companion pieces to that video. This one here is my top 10 favorite books from since I started keeping track of my reading just over 3 years ago. And since I read a little over 200 books since then, this list is nothing but cream off the top. That said, this is my top 10, not the top 10, and while I like to think that I have good taste, no 2 readers are going to overlap perfectly. Give this list a listen, and then pick out something you think you'll enjoy. As for the second video, stay tuned for my top 10 authors. I've made sure there's no overlap between the 2 lists, so I hope you'll give that one a watch too. Without further ado, let's go through my top 10. First on my list, at spot number 10, is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Elias Sainz. This is a story about family, the things they do to support each other and protect the safe, normal life they've built. How do you feel close to a parent who is changed by war? How do you protect your best friend who's come out as gay? How do you reconcile the fact that you love your brother with the fact that he's been in prison for a very long time for a crime that no one will name? Bit by bit, Aristotle learns the minutiae of the people he cares about and how to relate to them. Number 9 is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Despite this being one of the most adapted stories we have, I managed to have never seen an adaptation of it before reading it last year, meaning I got to experience it as it was written. Since then, I've seen 2 stage adaptations, and I've got to say, the book was better. Usually I don't go for epistolary novels because I find that they tend to be more reflective than action-packed, but in this case, most of the story was made up of characters desperately trying to communicate what partial information they had to one another. As a result, a style that I usually find kills tension becomes ruinously effective. 8th on the list is Jessie Daniels' Nice White Ladies. 2 years ago, I began learning to navigate my racial identity in a world that raised me as the beneficiary of white supremacy. The conundrum that I seemed to run up against was that white women are supposed to be nice. We go along to get along. This extends to keeping quiet about injustice, wherever we find it. I found this book in a critical moment in this work. It cuts to the heart of so many ways that white women are bound up in and complicit in perpetuating white supremacy, and offers real solutions that may help us heal. The 7th book on this list is one of a similar theme, Ruby Hamad's White Tears, Brown Scars: How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. Sometimes, 2 very similar books both make the top 10 list. Hamad writes even more directly about white women's role in gumming up the feminist movement. Her book speaks to women who are racialized and gives voice to dynamics that every woman of color goes through. In fact, when one of Hamad's readers posted one of her articles to her Facebook, that woman's white colleagues felt so threatened by that article that they complained to management and had her fired for creating a hostile work environment. This book is not for white women. Reading it is an opportunity to hear the conversation. 6th up is M.L. Rio's If We Were Villains. One doesn't often get to live the experience of reading a Shakespearean tragedy for the first time with no spoilers. For example, I've read Romeo and Juliet so many times that I can't imagine there being any dramatic tension in hearing a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. From the beginning, we know Oliver has spent 10 years in prison. The rest of the book tells the story of how he got there, through the fog of shifting alliances and interpersonal psychology, from the starting point of being a theater student. In 5th place, the Gawain poets, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. As far back as I can remember, this was my favorite story my family would read at Christmas time. There are some beautiful translations of this poem which underscore the composition of the English language and how the sounds and the words play together. Fundamentally, this story is about personal integrity and consent. What will you take when you know you have to give as much in return? It has some of the most tightly written theming I've read in any story, and I can wholeheartedly recommend it to anyone looking to read their first King Arthur story. Quick disclaimer, I didn't realize until after I finished writing this list that this next book was one that I actually read before I started keeping track of my books on Instagram, but I've never talked about it and I love it so much that it's staying on the list, and here we go. Number 4 is Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver. In the year's Best Horror and Dark Fantasy 2017, there's one story that stands head and shoulders above the rest. I told everybody about it whom I thought would enjoy it, but when I told my friend, he said he had the novel version at home. Set in an imaginary medieval kingdom in Eastern Europe, this story centers around 3 young women and their fight against Astaric and an encroaching endless winter. The true strength of this story comes from the fact that the world, its dangers, the characters, and their motives all make sense together. The second runner-up is Anne Rice's The Interview with the Vampire. In most vampire stories, faith saves you from the monster. However, Rice's vampires were once human too, and agonize over the state of their souls. Is there any hope of redemption for some creature of the devil who kills every night? Or are there even any creatures of the devil in a world that was created by and is presided over by God? Could it even be the case that vampires, by virtue of being creatures who kill indiscriminately, are made closer to God? Rice's novel about the grief of losing one's faith is one of the most beautifully sad ones I've ever read. Second from the top is Nabokov's Lolita. There are 2 kinds of books I enjoy. Those I read to get to the end, and those I read simply to read. This was the first book I read for that latter reason, and I returned to it again and again to experience the joy of those words slipping past. I know how it'll all end. I know how much Lolita will suffer. It's not about any of that. It's about all of the little steps along the way, all the moments that are just as important as the big and famous ones. The final best story on this list is Libba Bray's The Diviners. When Evie O'Neill discovers that she has and can harness the power of reading everyday objects through touch, her life in the New York of the Roaring Twenties becomes one of violence, power, addiction, and politics. While the story is set in the past, it's nonetheless entrenched in the themes and preoccupations of our own time. She and her diviner friends grapple with questions of race, sexuality, generational differences and traumas, family, both of birth and of choice, and ultimately the question, what does it take to create the community you want to live in? Thank you for joining me in this rundown of my favorite books I've read in the last few years. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of them, what your favorite books are, I love recommendations, and what you're looking forward to reading next. Last but not least, keep an eye out for my list of top 10 authors who write nothing but gold.